So on January 24th, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, observing what ICE and Border Patrol have been doing in his city, which is just terrifying so many immigrant families, that their children are unwilling to leave the house. He wrote, "We have got children in Minnesota hiding in their houses, afraid to go outside. Many of us grew up reading that story of Anne Frank. Somebody's going to write that children's story about Minnesota." So after that, Waltz was attacked by the Anti-Defamation League and the Holocaust Museum in Washington and Trump's anti-Semitism envoy for having kind of desecrated the history of the Nazi Holocaust by invoking Anne Frank's name to talk about what happened in Minnesota, even though Tim Walz was not saying that children in Minnesota were being sent to death camps. He didn't say anything like that. He simply was saying that there were children who were hiding in their homes and that perhaps one of those children would be writing a diary that people would write that day. I mean, it's just important to make this should be an obvious point, but not every comparison of everything, not every comparison with the Nazis is to suggest that the thing being compared to the Nazis is involved in a process of mass extermination. The Nazis did many, many things in addition to the mass extermination of Jews and Roma and LGBT folks and others, right? But these organizations, the ADL, the Holocaust Museum, right, basically don't want to use the example of the Holocaust to suggest that this something terrible is happening in Minnesota. They're much less concerned about the massive human rights abuses and massive violations of the rule of law that are happening in Minnesota and across the country than in maintaining the claim that nothing can be compared to the Holocaust, or at least no other human rights abuses can be compared to the Holocaust, because they have no problem, for instance, comparing the Iranian regime with the Nazis if that serves Israeli foreign policy. Interestingly, a few days after Waltz's comments, there was another analogy to the Holocaust, and this came from Moshe Boogie Ayalon. Boogie is his nickname. Boogie Ayalon is not a leftist radical. He was actually the chief of staff of the IDF, and then he was Benjamin Netanyahu's defense minister from 2013 to 2016. And I'm going to read you snippets of the translation of what Boogie Ayalon wrote. He wrote, on the last Tuesday evening, I participated in an event marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day. When I got home, I received a message about Jewish pogromists attacking Palestinians in southern Mount Hebron, stealing their sheep and burning their property. And then he writes, "You can't compare." He goes on, after ambulances which tried to reach the scene were delayed by the Jewish terrorists, 3 Palestinians were evacuated to the hospital, one of them suffering from skull fractures. And then he says, quote, "No one can compare to the Holocaust that's happened to us." You see, he's actually mocking groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the Holocaust Museum who get more upset about analogizing things to the Holocaust than they do actually to brutal attacks on people's dignity. And he goes on, to this day, no Jewish terrorist has been arrested because Israel's police is controlled by a convicted criminal, a racist and fascist Kahanist. The Shin Bet is controlled by representatives of Jewish supremacy. And then he goes on, the ideology of Jewish supremacy, which has become dominant in the Israeli government, reminds one of the Nazi racial theory. And then he goes on, but it's forbidden to compare. And he goes on, he talks about all the parts of the Israeli military forces that he commanded. He said, I knew the warnings of Professor Yeshayahu Leibovich against the process of moral coarsening to the point of turning us into quote unquote Judeo-Nazis. That was Leibovich's phrase. And then he says, as of today, Professor Leibovich was right and I was wrong. Now, I think none of these organizations, the Holocaust Museum, the Anti-Defamation League, Trump's anti-Semitism envoy, none of them will have the guts to actually attack Boogie Ayalon for this Holocaust comparison, right? Because in reality, if you are Israeli, you can get away with making these comparisons all the time. And in fact, there's a list by the writer Zach Foster just of the enormous number of times throughout Israeli history in which Israeli leaders have compared Israeli policies or other Israeli politicians or tendencies to the Nazis. It happens all the time, right? But the real divide here is between people who feel that the memory of the Holocaust against Jews should be used in order to try to defend the rights of vulnerable people who were being abused and persecuted and brutalized, even if, of course, they're not being abused and brutalized and persecuted in exactly the same way or to the same extent that Jews were when they were slaughtered by 6 million of them, and people who essentially want to segregate off the question of the Holocaust and who are more offended by the idea of people invoking the Holocaust in order to defend the human rights and human dignity of people than they are by the attacks on the human dignity of those people themselves. And that's where the American Jewish leadership is today. And it's striking that they are so morally coarse, even as in the wake of Israel having committed what human rights groups now call a genocide, even in the wake of Donald Trump committing human rights abuses in the United States, which are truly jaw-dropping in how frightening and profound they are, that still the American Jewish leadership is more upset about Holocaust analogies than it is by the actual abuses themselves, whereas Boogie Yalon, to his credit, is just fed up with this stuff and calling bullshit on it. And I think it's really refreshing to see.